All the characters in the story are over 18 years old. I don't remember exactly when I started hating my father. Now I just often doubt if I ever loved him at all. I know one thing for sure. He definitely never loved me. He didn't love anyone at all except himself. When I was still a girl, I could probably somehow live without his fatherly love. Or maybe I just didn't know it could be any other way. His frown was accepted by my childish, cheerful perception as the norm. I didn't think or guess that it could be any other way. I didn't know that, in principle, dads can have kind eyes or affectionate hands. The person who raised me never had that. When at some point I began to turn from a puny girl into a young girl, my life deprived of love and kindness began to transform into something unbearable. For some reason, my father decided that I, like my mother, would definitely be a cheater. And in order for this not to happen, in his opinion, I had to be brought up under very strict control. There was no reason to think that way about me. It was very insulting and painful that he didn't trust me. During this period, my father turned from just someone else's uncle, who by chance lived in our apartment, suddenly turned into a cruel tyrant obsessed with the idea of total control. At that time, my life turned into an analog of a maximum security prison. Every day, when he met me from school, he made me report and tell me who I was talking to and what we were talking about. God forbid if I suddenly mentioned any of the boys in our class. An hour-long lecture on how modest girls should behave was simply guaranteed. All my clothes were subject to strict regulations. And God forbid if he finds even a milligram of any makeup on his face. All my girlfriends have been thoroughly checked and approved by him. He simply forbade me to be friends with anyone else whom he considered a bad influence on me. When I started studying in high school, all my friends suddenly went into fashion for short skirts. All the girls relentlessly followed this fashion, shortening their skirts as much as it was decent at all. Many of them were successful with the guys from high school. I was gradually becoming some kind of outcast. Few people wanted to be friends with me, and I really wanted to. I had to adjust somehow and hide the second set of my school uniform from my father. As a result of such constant pressure from him, I wanted to do everything to spite him. For example, he very strictly forbade me to communicate with boys. At the peak of his beliefs, I was probably the first in my class to have a real affair with a high school student who had a pretty bad reputation as a womanizer. When I knew love, I suddenly realized that my father was still a prude. He always demanded purity and chastity from me, while he himself often went to brothels to girls of easy virtue. I figured this out pretty quickly when I began to understand the relationship between men and women and analyzing his trips to the left and excuses to his mother. Such duplicity and insincerity were very strongly felt in my early tender age, and it made me very angry. But probably if he hadn't terrorized me so much, then I would have been able to put up with his hypocrisy and continue to live on, adjusting and hiding my second life from him. I could have tolerated his greedy way of managing the household in our apartment, when he constantly took away my meager earnings from my mother or spent my pennies from casual part-time jobs after school. I could have borne his reproaches, slaps on the back of the head, and his maniacal desire to maintain cleanliness in the entire apartment, which led to the fact that my mother and I constantly had to clean the whole house to shine. In fact, we were just his slaves, to whom he did not give a drop of freedom. But I would have put up with it all. Everything changed after the incident when he beat my mother badly drunk. I don't even know the reason why they had a quarrel, but when I saw the open mockery on his part, something broke in me. It was at that moment that I realized that I hated my father so much. I hate him so much that I'm even ready to do things that can harm him and that maybe I'll regret later. But I was young, determined, and I sincerely wanted to take revenge on him for my mother's bruises and for the prison years that I spent in his house. The revenge plan was also formed somehow quickly. I decided that the best way to hurt him would be to make him see and realize that all the fruits of his harsh upbringing had gone down the drain. He wanted me to be clean and chaste. I need him to see that, thanks to his efforts, I came out dirty. It was necessary to make sure that he saw it in the most unpleasant light at the right moment and in the right situation. Such a well-aimed blow to his ambition would surely be very painful. I was elated with my idea. I knew perfectly well that in order to implement the revenge plan, I would have to degrade. I wasn't attracted to the idea, but it wasn't that scary either. Of course, I loved making love to a guy, but I didn't feel a burning desire for it. I didn't care. I was an ordinary girl with an ordinary temperament. But it was the thought of sweet revenge that pushed me to take the first step towards implementing my plan. Technically, it turned out to be not so difficult to do either. All that remained was to be patient and follow his plan. That same day, I secretly went to the very brothel that my dad often visited. It took me exactly 3 hours to learn the basic skills of a professional call girl. The brothel owner was my personal trainer. It took me only 3 hours to understand and memorize all these simple wisdom of the priest of love. It takes much less time and is much easier than, say, it would take to become a doctor, which I have dreamed of since childhood. I started working in a brothel during my extracurricular time. Now all that remained was to gain work experience and wait for an opportunity. About 6 months later, a similar case presented itself. It's more accurate to say that he didn't introduce himself, but I carefully designed it myself. It just took 6 months to put together all the threads that I had cunningly woven. The first step was to convince a famous director to make his next film in our city. To do this, I wrote and sent him the appropriate script. To be more convincing, I went to his audition. After he appreciated my abilities and wished to use my fresh body in his work, I began to set conditions that I wanted to play the main role in my own script. In addition, all the scenes of the film should be filmed in our brothel. He didn't resist for long and quickly agreed. He hasn't had bright, fresh actresses like me for a long time. At that moment, I was clearly aware of my talent and good data for an actress. Without false modesty, I can say that I was pretty good. Nature has rewarded me with an athletic body and endurance. Paradoxically, my vicious face always looked young and innocent, especially if I was portraying it. In general, all the things that the brothel's customers liked. I intuitively felt how to turn to the camera and what a sweet expression to portray on my face so that it would be beautiful. I knew that I was talented, so I had no doubt that the director would bite. I read men's minds like an open book and could do whatever I wanted with them. The second step was to convince the owner of our brothel to provide her territory for filming. It wasn't difficult either. Since I quickly became a popular employee with low social responsibility in her institution, for whom customers were queuing, I had every reason to try to blackmail her a little. In addition, it was not necessary to blackmail much, since the reputation of the institution could go up sharply after such an advertisement when a famous director makes a shoot at her. The third step was to convince my father to go to a brothel for the very filming that was presented to the public in the form of a play. It turned out to be a piece of cake. It was enough for him to slip an advertising brochure announcing the search for men for the filming of the film. I found out that he had submitted an application and that he had been accepted from my submission within a few hours. In mid-November, on the appointed day, everything went according to plan. About 50 different men gathered in the large reception hall of our brothel, draped with red curtains. They were all a little nervous. I was looking for my father. Here it is. I put a mask on my face and went out to the men. The script of the film was outrageously simple. Whoever can give the actress maximum pleasure, she will show her face and he will become the winner of a big prize. The men happily accepted the terms of the competition. I gave the numbers to all the men. Dad got the last number. He was quietly angry with annoyance. In the description of the performance, it was stated that men have no restrictions on their imagination. The only limitation was that they couldn't try to take off my mask. It's one thing to think about all this and imagine it with a cool, reasonable head, and it's quite another thing to experience it all in kind, taking a direct part in the action, to see his reaction and make sure of the depravity of his thoughts. When my father started acting, I took off my mask. At the same moment, according to my plan, all the red curtains draping the walls in the hall parted to the sides, and bright spotlights shone their light on the huge posters that opened. The posters showed me surrounded by several men. I wasn't wearing a mask. There were a lot of different photos. My father, distracted by the bright lights from the girl lying under him, was looking at the posters and did not notice that I had taken off my mask at that moment. As he looked at the posters, the pupils in his eyes began to dilate. He began to recognize the girl from the posters and was horrified by the realization of who it was. He clearly couldn't believe his eyes. He thought it was all photoshopped, but then he looked down and our eyes met. He was slowly getting to know me, and it began to dawn on him exactly what he was doing right now. "Daughter," Are you? How is that? You brought me to this, Dad. It seems like he's going to have a stroke right now. He tries to answer me, but he doesn't have enough air. The cameras record with documentary accuracy all the stages of agony on his changing red face. Maybe he loved me after all, since he took my blows so hard? I'll never know now.